remember that day so vividly because it was one of those perfect Texas summer Saturdays. One of those days that makes you feel lucky to live in a place where you know your neighbors, the lawns are freshly mowed, and the loudest thing you hear is laughter. Our annual block party was in full swing. Folding tables covered in potluck dishes, music floating from a speaker on the community lawn, kids racing around with popsicles melting down their hands. You could smell grilled meat and coconut sunscreen drifting through the heat. I just finished a long night shift at the ER, so I was soaking it all in. The ordinary, the predictable. No emergencies, no beeping monitors, just a warm afternoon with my husband and our 2 kids. But then, out of nowhere, I saw that guy. He was standing near the bounce house, alone. Mid-40s, baseball cap shading his eyes, an expensive-looking camera hanging from a strap around his neck. He wasn't talking to anyone, just sort of drifting at the edge of the crowd. Didn't think twice. I assumed he was just someone's visiting relative or a photographer hired to cover the event. But when I looked over a second time, something felt off. I leaned over to my friend Claire, who's lived in the neighborhood even longer than I have, and nodded in his direction. "Who's that?" I asked. She followed my gaze, then shrugged. Never seen him before. I thought that was all there was to it. But when I looked back again, I realized something. The camera wasn't aimed at the tables or the decorations or even the crowd. It was tracking the kids. More specifically, my kids. I felt myself stand up straighter. He was following them through the viewfinder, zooming in as they moved between the bounce house and the snack table. I walked over, making sure to put myself between him and them. And that's when he looked up at me and smiled. It wasn't the polite smile you give a stranger at a neighborhood event. It was the smile of someone who already knew me. "Hey, Maggie," he said, casual as anything. "They've grown so much." I stopped in my tracks. I've worked in emergency rooms for years. I've had strangers yell at me, thank me, beg me for help. I've seen every expression under the sun. But there's something deeply wrong about hearing your own name from a face you don't recognize. And then, without hesitation, he said both my kids' full names, first and last, like he'd known them for years. "Still loves grape popsicles, huh?" he added, chuckling. I kept my voice even. "I'm sorry. Do I know you?" He looked at me like I'd just hurt his feelings. "Oh, you know me. We go way back." Every muscle in my body wanted to get my husband over there, but I didn't want to turn my back on him. I gave a little wave to get my husband's attention, but when I looked back at the man, he was already walking toward the street. Not in a hurry, like someone who thought he'd been caught. Just leaving. I asked around after he was gone. No one knew who he was. No one had invited him. The HOA hadn't hired a photographer. That night, after the kids went to bed, I replayed the scene over and over in my head. I couldn't figure out which part unsettled me more. That he knew my name, that he knew my kids' names, or that he knew something so small and specific as my youngest's favorite popsicle flavor. A week later, it got worse. I was going through the mail when I spotted a plain, unmarked envelope. No return address. Inside was a single printed photo. My kids. Laughing. One of them holding a grape popsicle. The photo had been taken from behind them, at just the right angle to avoid me in the frame. The same spot where he'd been standing. I showed the photo to my husband and told him everything that had happened. We started making changes immediately. From then on, the kids were never left alone, even for a few minutes. We told the entire neighborhood about the man, passed around his description, and made it clear that if anyone spotted him again, they should call the police right away. I never saw him again, but the fear never went away. Every block party since, I still find myself scanning the crowd, hoping I never see that face again. My name's Jenna, and I've lived in this neighborhood for just over 3 years. I work from home, and it has its perks. No commute, no dress code, no awkward break room small talk. But there's also this weird thing where the days and nights start to blur together. Some nights, I'm in bed by 10. Others, I'm up at 2 in the morning tweaking fonts for a client who just wants it to pop more. That night, I was somewhere in between, not working, but not tired enough for bed. I was curled up on the couch, laptop balanced on a pillow, a mug of chamomile tea on the coffee table. The curtains were drawn, the air conditioner was humming, and my only company was the voice of a YouTuber walking through Illustrator shortcuts I already knew, but liked to have on in the background. Outside, the street was still. Gilbert isn't a loud place at night. Mostly families, retirees, and the occasional high schooler sneaking back home after curfew. From my front window, you can see the cul-de-sac across the street, lined with orange-lit porches and trimmed hedges. Safe. Predictable. Or at least, it always felt that way. It was close to midnight when my phone buzzed. Motion alert. Front porch. The doorbell cam sends me alerts all the time. A moth flying too close, a gust of wind setting off the sensor. I almost ignored it, but the thumbnail looked off. It wasn't the usual pale, overexposed blob. It had shape. Shadow. I tapped it open. And there he was. A man, sitting cross-legged in my patio chair. The one right beside my front door. He was perfectly upright, hands resting on his knees like he was posing for a picture. His head was tilted slightly forward, eyes locked straight into the camera, and he was smiling. The smile was stretched, held in place too long, just enough to make it look wrong. I muted the audio feed without thinking, because for some reason the idea of hearing him was worse than seeing him. For a few seconds, I just stared at the screen, trying to slot him into some kind of category in my head. Neighbor? Lost delivery guy? Friend of a friend? But nothing fit. He was dressed casually, dark jacket, jeans, sneakers, but there was nothing familiar about him, and there was no car in my driveway or on the street. What really got me, though, was how still he was. Not tapping a foot, not shifting in the chair, barely even blinking. I thought about opening the door and telling him to leave, but I couldn't make myself do it. That smile made it feel like if I stepped outside, something would happen. I didn't know what, but I didn't want to find out. Instead, I grabbed my phone and called the non-emergency police line. The dispatcher sounded bored. She asked if he'd tried to get in. I told her no, but he was sitting right in front of my door, smiling into the camera, and I didn't know him. She told me to stay inside, keep the doors locked, and wait for a patrol car. I asked how long it would take. She hesitated, then said they'd get someone there as soon as possible. I kept the live feed open, sitting on the floor just to the side of my front window, where I could see both the street and my phone screen. 5 minutes passed, then 10, then 20. He didn't move. The smile never wavered. Every once in a while, I'd see the tiny rise and fall of his shoulders when he breathed, but that was it. I started to wonder if maybe he was drunk or high, but he wasn't slouching or losing balance. It was like he had picked that exact spot and was just waiting. Around the 30-minute mark, I caught myself holding my own breath every time his eyes seemed to refocus, like he was looking through the camera into my living room. 40 minutes after my call, I finally saw headlights sweep across my driveway. Relief hit me so hard I almost laughed. I looked back at the feed to watch the officers approach, but the chair was empty. Just like that. I jumped to the window, ready to catch him walking away down the street, but there was nothing. The two officers came up to the door, and I let them in, explaining what happened while one of them stepped over to the chair. He pressed his hand into the cushion, then looked at his partner. "Still warm," he said. They searched the street, checked a few yards, and even knocked on a couple of neighbors' doors. No one had seen a man matching my description. No one had heard anything. When they left, they told me to call if he came back. I slept maybe 3 hours that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured that same posture, that same smile, sitting just on the other side of my door. The next morning, sunlight almost made it feel like nothing had happened. I opened the door to get the mail, but I stopped halfway. The chair cushion was slightly dented, like someone had sat in it again. I convinced myself it was just from the night before, but I still went straight to my phone to check the doorbell cam history. At 4:12 a.m., the man had returned. Same chair, same position, same jacket. That smile was still plastered on his face, like it had never left. He didn't knock or try to get in. He just sat there, staring. I called the cops again. My voice was shaking as I told them he was back. They said they'd make a note of it, but since he wasn't actively trying to break in, there was nothing they could do. Their advice was simple. Keep the doors locked, don't open the door, and don't go outside if I saw him again. I hung up feeling more trapped than relieved. I still don't know what I'm supposed to do if he comes back. My backyard is the one thing I let myself be precious about. I rent the place, a small 2-bedroom duplex, but the patch of green behind the sliding glass door feels like mine in a way the beige carpet never will. It's maybe 20 feet deep, fenced on 3 sides with cedar slats that have gone gray in the rain. It's nothing fancy, a patch of grass that never quite grows evenly, a tiny garden I started in thrifted planters, and 2 mismatched patio chairs I found for free on Facebook Marketplace. I strung fairy lights along the back fence, and at night, they glow just enough to make the space feel like my own little bubble. On my days off, I like to spend mornings watering the herbs or reading outside. It's quiet, private. At least, that's what I thought. One Saturday morning, I went out to water the basil and parsley and saw them. 3 cigarette butts in the far corner, right next to the lilac bush. I don't smoke, neither do my friends. The fence back there is solid, no gaps, no easy way for something to blow through. Still, I convinced myself maybe the wind carried them from next door. I tossed them in the trash and didn't think much of it. A few days later, there were more. Same brand, some generic label I didn't recognize, and they were arranged in almost the exact same spot. It wasn't just weird. It was intentional. On my next day off, I caught my neighbor, Mrs. Patel, as she was unloading groceries. She's in her 60s, always sweet, and we usually chat about my garden or her cat. I asked if she'd noticed anyone hanging around our fence line. She shook her head and said, "No, dear. But last week, I thought I heard someone walking through the gravel between our yards at night. My husband went out to check, but didn't see anyone." She shrugged it off as a raccoon. I wanted to believe her, but in the back of my mind, I started thinking about how those cigarette butts kept showing up in the exact same place. 2 days later, after a closing shift, I got home a little after midnight. I made tea and sat on the couch scrolling through my phone. For some reason, I decided to step outside for air. It was one of those warm, quiet nights where you can hear every sound. Crickets, a dog barking somewhere far off. I slid the door open and stepped out onto the patio. That's when I froze. I saw the faint orange glow of a cigarette just behind the lilac bush. The glow didn't move. It took me a second to realize the person holding it wasn't standing. They were crouched. I backed inside, locked the door, and yanked the curtains shut. My hands felt unsteady, but I grabbed my phone and called the non-emergency line. The dispatcher told me to stay inside, keep the lights on, and a patrol car would swing by when they could. 45 minutes. That's how long it took. By the time the police arrived, I was peeking out from the bedroom window. The lilac bush looked empty. No glow, no figure. One officer walked into the backyard with a flashlight, shining it along the fence line. He didn't see anyone, but said he'd do a sweep of the street. The other officer lingered by the patio chair, asking if I knew anyone who might have a problem with me. After about 10 minutes, they left, saying they'd file a report. I tried to sleep after that, but every time the wind brushed against the house, I sat up. When I finally worked up the nerve to step outside the next morning, the cigarette butts were gone. All of them, even the ones I hadn't touched. In their place, there was something worse. A trail of muddy boot prints. They started at the lilac bush, crossed the grass in a straight line, and stopped right at my back door. The last print was angled toward the glass, like whoever it was had just stood there, watching. I wanted to tell myself it was a drunk neighbor who wandered into the wrong yard, or maybe some bored teenager playing a prank. But every time I looked at those boot prints, that explanation felt thinner. Whoever it was had been there more than once. They weren't stumbling around randomly. They'd chosen a spot and kept coming back to it. 2 nights later, I was woken up by a noise. It wasn't loud, just a faint scrape, like something brushing against the fence. I stayed in bed listening. Then I heard it again, this time closer to my window. I reached for my phone, and as I did, there was a sharp tap against the glass. Not loud enough to break it. Just enough. I didn't look. I couldn't. I stayed in bed clutching my phone until morning. The final straw came a week later. It was a Sunday afternoon, and I was home between shifts. I had a short morning shift and a long closing shift later that night. I stepped into the backyard to water the plants, and as I bent down to check the basil, I noticed something shiny in the dirt near the lilac bush. It was a lighter. Not mine. I looked up and noticed a cigarette butt on the fence post itself, balanced like it had been placed there on purpose. That was it for me. I called my landlord and told him everything. He came by that evening. We walked around the yard together, and within minutes, he pointed to something I'd missed. Partial boot prints leading along the fence on the outside. He checked every inch of the fence, looking for gaps or loose boards, but everything was solid. After he left, I called the police. They came, took a report, and left me with more questions than answers. That same day, I bought motion sensor lights, had them installed around the backyard. I even put up a security camera. Still, I keep the back door locked at all times, and I can't bring myself to look out the back window after dark. I've started thinking about moving out entirely. That's the kind of fear that stays with you, especially when you know someone's been that close. Working night shifts does strange things to your body clock. You get used to eating breakfast at 6 p.m., grocery shopping when the store is empty, and lying awake while everyone else is asleep. so waking up at 3 a.m. didn't feel strange. What was strange was hearing splashing outside. At first, I thought it was the neighbor's dog. They have a lab that's obsessed with water, and sometimes it barks at its own reflection in my pool fence. But the sound was different. Not the frantic splashing of an animal playing, but steady, purposeful movement. I slipped out of bed and padded into the kitchen. From there, I've got a clear view of the pool through the sliding glass doors. My finger paused above the pool light switch. The second the pool lit up, I stopped breathing. There was a man standing in the deep end, fully dressed, water up to his shoulders, his hair plastered to his head. His eyes locked on me like he'd been waiting for me to show up. He didn't thrash or swim or try to get out. He just stood there, staring. I'm not easily rattled. If you work in the ER, you can't be. But every instinct told me not to go outside, not to open that door. I stepped back and grabbed my phone, dialing 911 as quietly as I could. My voice was steady when I told the dispatcher what I was seeing. She told me to stay inside, lock the doors, and wait. When I peeked again, he was gone. Just gone. The pool water rippled like something had moved through it fast, but the deck was empty. I tried to spot movement beyond the fence, thinking maybe he'd gone around the side yard, but nothing. It couldn't have been more than 3 minutes before I heard the distant sound of the patrol car. When the officers arrived, I met them at the front door and led them straight to the backyard. The first thing they noticed, wet footprints on the pool deck. They trailed toward the side gate, but the gate was locked from the inside. The officers checked it themselves. To leave that way, he would have had to unlock it, step through and lock it behind him from the wrong side. They searched the perimeter, the neighbor's yard, even the alley behind the houses. Nothing. I asked one of them if maybe he could have climbed the fence. They both looked at it, 8 feet high, solid paneling, no ledges, and just shook their heads. When they left, they suggested I install extra cameras and keep the pool gate padlocked. I already had cameras, but the pool area was in a blind spot. I barely slept. I stayed in the living room all night. Every sound from outside made me check the back door. By sunrise, I'd convinced myself it was some drunk who wandered into the wrong yard and panicked when I turned on the light. That was easier to believe than anything else. The next night, I came home from work around 1 a.m. The yard was still, the pool dark. I made tea, sat at the counter, scrolling through my phone. At some point, I looked out the glass doors. Nothing. And went back to reading. But when I looked again, maybe 10 minutes later, there were wet footprints on the deck. Fresh. No one in sight. I didn't even go outside. I called the non-emergency line and told them what I'd found. When the officers showed up, the prints were still there. They walked the perimeter again. Still nothing. That's when one of them asked if I'd ever had anyone try to break in before. I told him no. The neighborhood's quiet. He suggested it might be someone who knows my schedule. Maybe someone who noticed I'm gone at night and comes around when they think I'm at work. That stuck in my head more than I wanted to admit. 2 nights later, I set up a chair in the dark kitchen with a clear view of the pool. I left the lights off and the glass door locked. Around 2:15 a.m., movement caught my eye. The water in the pool shifted like something had disturbed it. And then, he was there, standing in the deep end again, fully dressed. I stayed in the chair. My phone was in my hand, but I didn't dial yet. I wanted to see what he'd do. For almost a full minute, he didn't move. Then, slow enough to make it worse, he lifted one hand out of the water and pointed toward the glass doors, pointed at me. That was enough. I called 911 again, never looking away from him, but as soon as I blinked, he was gone. The officers came back, took my statement again, and suggested motion lights. I already had them, but I installed another set aimed directly at the pool deck. For a week, nothing happened. Then, last Friday, I came home from work and saw the pool lights on. I never leave them on. I stepped into the yard and stopped at the edge of the deck. The water was calm. Too calm. When I got closer, I saw something at the bottom of the deep end. A black hoodie. It wasn't mine. I fished it out with the skimmer and left it dripping on the concrete while I checked the gate. Still locked. No footprints. The police took the hoodie, but they didn't seem hopeful. No signs of forced entry. No sign anyone had even been there that night. I haven't seen him since. But now, every time I walk past the sliding doors, I check the pool. I keep expecting to see him there. Soaked. Staring. And every time I reach for the pool lights, I swear I can almost see the water ripple before I even touch the switch. I'm the kind of person who likes routines so much, I write them on sticky notes, even when I don't need to. Walking Honey at night was my way of winding down after work. She's a senior golden retriever with eyebrows that make her look permanently worried. She's a slow walker these days, hip issues, and prefers the long loop around the park. The neighborhood streets in summer were usually still warm after sunset, smelling faintly of jasmine from the park hedges. It was late, later than usual, when we headed out. Warm air, barely a breeze. No cars, no kids, just the noises of a far-off lawn sprinkler. I liked it that way. Fewer distractions for Honey, and a little time where the only thing I had to think about was the rhythm of our steps. When we reached the park, the street lamps thinned out. Right at that moment, I saw him, a man sitting alone on one of the benches near the path. Gray hoodie, jeans, elbows on his knees like he'd been there a while. As we passed, he smiled at me and said, "Hey, sunshine?" Honey's reaction was instant, tail wagging like I'd just opened the treat jar. She trotted over, and before I could tug her back, the man leaned down, scratched her ears, and said, "I've missed you." I laughed, but it was the kind of laugh you give a stranger in an elevator. Polite, but ready to get out. "Her name's Honey," I told him. He just smiled wider. I gave Honey a gentle tug, muttered, "Have a good night," and kept walking. By the time I looked back, he was still sitting there, watching. The next evening, I didn't take the park route. Not because of him, I told myself, but because Honey had been slowing down lately. Still, halfway down the block, I caught myself looking over my shoulder. 2 nights later, same time, same route. I told myself if he was there again, I'd take a different street. He wasn't on the bench. But as we passed the park's side fence, Honey's ears perked up. She stopped, sniffing at a gap in the hedge, tail wagging again. I pulled her along. We were halfway home when I realized I'd been walking faster than usual. 2 days later, I got home from the library around 5 p.m. and found Mrs. Callahan, my 82-year-old neighbor, standing in her yard. She leaned on her rake, waved me over, and said, "Oh, I keep meaning to ask, your friend's been by a lot lately." My friend? You know, the fellow who likes to visit Sunshine in the afternoons. It took me a second. "Do you mean Honey?" Mrs. Callahan nodded like she was sure. He's very nice, always polite, comes by the gate, calls her over, gives her a little scratch. You must have told him she likes that nickname. I didn't say anything right away. Honey's never been called Sunshine in her life. That night, I lay in bed replaying the conversation. Mrs. Callahan's yard doesn't have a clear view of mine. Just enough through the gaps in the fence to see Honey if she's near the gate. For her to notice, he'd have to be standing right there. And I'd been at work every time. The next afternoon, I came home earlier than usual, parked in the driveway instead of the garage, left my bag inside and stood in the dark of the living room, looking out through the sheer curtains at the backyard. For 20 minutes, nothing happened. Honey lay in the patch of sun near the gate, dozing. Then she lifted her head. Her tail started wagging. I stepped closer to the window. A man was at the gate. Hoodie again, put up despite the heat. He crouched, one hand through the bars, scratching behind her ears. I couldn't hear him, but I could see his mouth moving. I pulled my phone from my pocket, but by the time I unlocked it, he'd stood up and walked out of sight. Not toward the street, but along the side fence, toward the back alley. That evening, I installed a cheap motion light over the gate. Not because I thought it would stop him, but because I wanted to know. 2 nights later, I got my answer. I was reading in bed when the backyard lit up. I moved to the window, staying in the shadows. He was standing in the center of the yard. Not at the gate this time, just standing there, looking toward the house. Honey wasn't wagging this time. She was lying down, head on her paws, watching him without moving. I stepped away to grab my phone. When I looked back, the yard was empty. After that, I started hearing things. Not every night, but often enough that I couldn't dismiss it. The faint metallic sound of the gate latch, the creak of the side fence, a low whistle from somewhere near the hedge. Once, coming home from a late shift, I found the motion light bulb unscrewed halfway, just enough so it wouldn't turn on. I told Mrs. Callahan about it a week later, careful not to scare her. She frowned, said she hadn't seen him lately, but then she added, "Well, not from here anyway." "What do you mean?" She hesitated, then said she'd seen him walking on the other side of the street, middle of the afternoon, carrying a grocery bag. He wasn't heading toward the park. He was heading toward my end of the block. Last week of July, I took Honey for an earlier walk. Still warm, but light enough to see a ways ahead. As we rounded the corner toward home, I spotted someone leaning on the fence by my driveway. Same hoodie. He saw us, smiled, and said, "Hey, Sunshine." This time, Honey didn't go to him. She pressed against my leg, tail still but ears forward. I didn't answer. Just walked past, fumbling with my keys even though we were still a house away. He didn't follow. The next day, I scheduled a locksmith to replace the side gate latch and add a padlock. I bought a better motion sensor and a camera for the backyard. That night at 3 a.m., the camera sent me an alert. I checked my phone. There he was, standing at the very edge of the camera's view, in the alley behind my fence, looking straight at the lens. I called the non-emergency police line. The officer I spoke with said they'd patrol the area, but there wasn't much they could do unless he trespassed. "Just keep your doors locked and don't engage with him," she advised. I hung up, feeling both relieved and frustrated. I bought heavier locks for the gate and a second deadbolt for the back door. Motion lights went up on both sides of the house. Still, even with the new locks and lights, a week later, just past midnight, I heard a noise in the backyard. the sound of the gate latch clicking. I ran to the back door and saw him, crouched, grabbing Honey's collar and dragging her to his direction. I flung the door open and yelled, and he bolted over the fence. I called the police immediately, but by the time they arrived, he was gone. Now, it's not about whether he's there tonight. It's about knowing he's tried to take her once, and that thought alone is enough to keep me awake. And I'll never risk leaving her out there alone again. If you thought the suburbs were safe, I hate to break it to you, but that's the real horror story. Hit that like button, subscribe for more horror stories, and tell me in the comments which story got under your skin. And if you've never been afraid of a friendly smile, prepare to be. Click now to watch 4 scary neighbor horror stories, because sometimes the worst monsters don't hide, they wave from their driveway. Stay alert, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next nightmare.